PPP Enterprise presents their 6th video in this series, How to Code in Python. Grab your calculator and let's together learn how to make one. In this video, we'll start looking into how to make a calculator on Python. So what essentially we're trying to do is we're trying to build everything we have learned already so far in all the other previous videos to try to create something that's useful we can do. Now for this video, in the beginning, I'm gonna make a part 2. We're gonna make a very simple calculator that can't do much, but then in the next video we'll try to go above. We'll try to go beyond that. But here I just want to lay down the fundamentals of how to build a calculator and what that can do and how to just structure your code. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to figure out how is the computer know we're going to multiply, add, or divide, or minus things together. So there's two ways you can do this. You can import math, but when you want to import math, it's usually for something a lot more complicated. Python in itself already has the fundamentals down. So for example, if you want to write like x equals 2 plus 2, and then you want to print x, it prints down 4. So it already knows those. And you can do multiply, so that's just an x. So that's just a times button. And when you run it, it gives you 4. So let's do 3 times 5. That's a lot easier. So that's 6. We add them together. That's 5. We divide them together. We divide them. We get 66. And when we minus them, get -1. So all these functions work. Now, there's two ways to do it. There's one really simple way and one a bit more complicated. But I think I'll do the complicated way just to kind of show how we can use these different things. So the first thing we're going to do is use the functions we learned 2 videos ago. So we can define something. We can define a function called add. And in here, we want 2 variables. We want x and y. And these are going to be the 2 variables we're going to add together. So in this case, we can say, okay, what do we want to return? So we're telling it we want a value to come back when we do this. So we put return x plus y. So now let's test it out. So let's say we have x equals 5, x equals 6, and y equals 2. And if we want to add those together, we can do add x comma y. So we're saying, okay, we're putting the x value of 6 in, and we're putting the y value of 6 in, and we'll get in return the solution. Now in terminal, it doesn't print out anything. That's because return doesn't print out anything. It just assigns a new value to it. And I'll show you what I mean. I'll show what I mean by that in a second. But if you print this out, here we go. We get 8. Now, since we've used the return, like I was saying before, this right here, this function in itself has a value of 8. That's the return function. That means I can do that. I can do add x comma y plus 2, and I get a value of 10. So that 8 value is just assigned with that, and you can do math on that. So just imagine that thing is just the result of that. That's why return functions are so useful, because if you didn't do that, you wouldn't necessarily be able to do this. Okay, so here's the add function. Let's define a new one. Let's define subtract, so sub. Do the same thing. And then you return x minus y. And then we can do this for multiplying as well. So we can define mul x comma y, return x times y, and define divide, div, we can just call it div, x comma y, return x divided by y. Now, whenever you have these 2 values, you can just assign them to those things. So we want kind of an interpreter for someone to be able to pick between these options. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to have some function in here, some ways we're going to ask them a choice. So the first thing you can say is we're going to ask them a choice. We can name something choice. Choice equals the input of the response, and then we can ask, before we do this, we ask for the numbers. So if we put number 1 equals input first number. Here we go. Number 2 then equals the second number, of course. So number 2 equals second number. Okay, good. Now I want to ask a choice. Do you want to, and then we're just going to put m. Do you want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So that's always how you want to do this. So you want to just put like, make it simple in some sense. Make it simple for them to pick which one they want to do. So under this, we put if choice equals A. Of course, you always want to put if choice equals A. Here you always want to put dot lower, just to make sure there's no confusion. So we have if choice equals A, and you have elif choice equals S. So that's for subtract. And you want to do elif choice equals M for multiply. And you can do an elif choice. Here you could also do an else, but what I like to do is I can show at the end here, and then you can put an else print invalid input. So here for A, you want to print. In order to make it more interesting, this is what I always like to do, just to make the code more interesting, we import time. What time does is what is an essential part of time that you can use is that it can slow down some function. So for example, if you say time.sleep and put in a number 1, this means that the code is going to do whatever it's doing, and then it's going to wait 1 second with doing the rest. So this is a way you can stop it. So what I would do it for is I would ask for the numbers, and they pick their choice. And then here you would say, okay, time, here you put print loading, or print, better, calculating, dots, and into time.sleep 1, and then you would go on to the next option. So what it's going to do, it's going to run through, it's going to pick the two numbers, it's going to print out calculating, then it's going to wait 1 second, and then it's going to give you the number. And that for the code, it doesn't change anything, but for someone using the code, it makes it a lot more applicable, because now you can all of a sudden, you can just instantly go in, and it just looks nicer, because it actually looks like a calculator and not just something that does it in 1 second. Right, so here we have, what do you want to do? You want to print, add, I want to put in two values, which is number 1, the first number 1, comma, number 2. Now the easier way would literally just to put number 1 plus number 2, but this right here is just to show you how functions could be used and why they might be essential. So this is not the most practical way of doing it, but it's just a show of how we can use those functions we learned to actually make something that could be useful, that could be impressive for someone to make. Here you go. This is again, it's a very short code. It's not too complicated. Here, and we put dev. Okay. Now, dev. Now when I run it, first number, 4. Second number, 5. Okay, we want to multiply them together. This is going to give us 20. It waits. And now we run into a problem. Why do we run into that problem? So what was my answer? My answer was M. And it's going to calculate. Okay, this is an interesting problem. And again, this is how you usually just code. You run something, you find out a problem, and then you try to solve it. Okay, so what is telling me down here, and now I'm going to go through my thought process how I would solve this. You can't multiply sequences by non-integer for a type string. Okay, so essentially what it's telling me is it's trying to multiply two numbers together. But the code isn't seeing that these two are numbers. Because I put this input value, it thinks it's a string. More like it thinks it's a person who wrote something. For example, if I wrote hi, it's trying to say, well, I can't multiply hi by hi. So we're going to have to define that this right here is an integer. You could also define it as a float, and I'll show the difference in a second. But let's define this as an integer. So when I put int around the input, the code essentially now knows these two things, they are integer values. So let's do it again, 4 and 5. I'm going to multiply them. Boom, we get 20. That worked perfectly. Now I want to fix up this code. Here we go. Okay. Now let's say we were dealing with floats. With integers, the main problem is that you can't have a dot. 4.5 times 4.5 won't work. And this is why I get this problem. Invalid literal for integer. Meaning it's not within the scope of an integer. So instead of using integers, if we want to use dots or decimal places, we want to use floats. So then we can define this as a float. So now, if you do 4.5 times 5.5, multiply them, we get a value. So that's why most code you would probably use float, but integers are nice when you're trying to count, when you're trying to figure out some like system of how to do it. Integers are quite nice to use. But for calculators, you really want to use floats because that's all points. It's also decimals and everything included within those decimal places that you want to keep. But yeah, essentially, I can run it again. This is how a very, very basic calculator works. Now, this can't really do anything else than just take these numbers and just calculate them down and giving you the numbers and giving you the values of it. But again, it's a way of showing how, first of all, you can define functions and how you can use functions, but how you can create something very simple out of what we know that could potentially be useful. So you don't need a big calculator or anything. But yeah, that was one of my videos on how to make a calculator within Python. I'll probably do a part 2 where I'll explain the more details of it, and I'll go into different calculations. I might go into log-based forms and quadratics and how to formulate those with Python to how to make it actually see those things or plotting points. But yeah,